single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand for New York.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Elise Klein. It's been more than 50 years since Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the United States. We reached that anniversary this month. After it was overturned in 2022, lawmakers here in New York have tried to expand protections by enshrining abortion in the state constitution and putting funding into the state budget for abortion care providers. They have also tried to help residents beyond the borders of New York. In the past 2 years, state lawmakers and the governor secured funding in the state budget to support abortion providers and passed a law allowing providers to prescribe abortion medication via telehealth to out-of-state residents where there are abortion bans. We sat down with State Senator Shelley Mayer to talk about how these measures will help address the issue now and what the legislative priorities will be this year at a time when another Trump administration heads to the White House. Thank you so much for joining us today, Senator.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So this month marks the anniversary of what would have been more than 50 years of Roe v. Wade since it was overturned in 2022. Consequently, many individuals around the country are feeling nervous, scared, and some even hopeless. What do you have to say to New Yorkers who might not be feeling so optimistic, and how are you feeling around this anniversary month?
Well, first place, I don't think we should diminish how it felt to have a right that we believed was constitutionally ours as women taken away after 50 years. It was really like striking in the heart. Some women cried, some women got angry. Most women said, what are we going to do about it? And for me, thinking about the women that I know that are not involved in politics, not involved in government, but are fearful that they can't handle a pregnancy, that they can't support a new baby, that their life is tumultuous already, that they may have other young children, that they and their spouse or their partner want to have a reasonable conversation early on in pregnancy. To think that that is not a choice that those women have, particularly those that don't live in states like New York, that's a problem, a serious problem. So I'm glad that we in New York have taken really strong steps to protect the right to abortion here as it was defined in Roe v. Wade. We did that right away after the decision came out, and then we've done other things. And so I'm confident and I feel good that we live in New York. But it should not be simply where you live or where you're born that determines what your rights are.
And as you were saying, I hear from the Democrats a lot that New York is a leading state on this front. But with the new Trump administration heading into the White House, consequently making a lot of individuals around the country nervous, what does New York have to look out for? And what are the priorities going to be here in Albany for this legislative session?
First is the very good news that we passed the state's Equal Rights Amendment, which puts in the New York State Constitution, not just in New York law, the protected right to reproductive health care, including abortion as defined in Roe. So that's a whole different thing. People don't understand when something is in a law, if the legislature changes, it could be changed. The governor changes, they could change it by executive order. Lots of things can happen. Once it's in the Constitution, it's so much harder to change. So that's why it was so important this year to pass this Equal Rights Amendment. And we faced all this blowback, which was really largely, in my opinion, inaccurate and misleading and full of political innuendo. It had very little to do with the real choices that women make and need to have the ability to make. So we passed that overwhelmingly throughout the state. And that will protect in the New York State Constitution the right to reproductive health care here in New York, not only for New Yorkers, but for those who physically come here. And then we've done some other things, as you know, through telehealth to try to ensure that women in other states have these rights as well.
And so what will the priorities be this legislative session? Do you have any bills on your mind of further protecting reproductive freedoms or birth control access?
I've already introduced one bill that deals with amending or building on my telehealth bill. And that bill that we passed and the governor signed allows licensed New York doctors and providers to prescribe medication abortion, which is more than 50% of abortions nationally, to women in other states, particularly in these red states, where literally even early in your pregnancy, you're prohibited in some states from having an abortion, from any of the access to reproductive health care. So we already have that. But what has happened already, the Attorney General of Texas has sued a doctor in New York for sending these pills to Texas. And so my new bill would change the labeling on those prescriptions that are sent to not necessarily have the doctor's name, but the practice name, so that we are guaranteeing the safety and security of licensed New York doctors who are doing what they are authorized to do under New York law from being sued, prosecuted, or criminally prosecuted by other state attorney generals.
And so do you think that will help potentially prevent more lawsuits? As you know, lawsuits have come in from the telehealth bill. So will this, I guess, help providers and protect them a little bit more, like you were saying?
Well, I think it's likely that this case by the Texas Attorney General will wind its way up to a higher court. And we knew that when we passed this bill, which other states have now done very similarly, and they've done this Prescription Protection Act that I'm talking about now, other states have done as well. So I think ultimately we're going to have to put our faith in the courts. And that's a difficult thing to do given this Supreme Court. But we believe we passed a constitutional law when we allowed this to happen. This is in New York. It is New York doctors. And all they're doing is sending you a pill to get to your home in whatever state. But for me, I think about the woman in Kentucky, the woman in Alabama, the woman in Tennessee, who really has no choices, is not going to physically be able to come to New York. We are doing our best in a legitimate constitutional way to ensure those women have access by using these New York doctors. And we're going to do everything we can to protect these New York doctors who are doing what they believe is not only their obligation, but their rights under New York law.
And why do you think this issue should continue to be a priority? I often hear from different lawmakers that, we've done enough on this front and that we don't really need to do anything else, that there's enough reproductive freedoms in New York. What do you have to say to, I guess, that argument, and why do you think this should continue to be a priority?
Well, first place, that argument was used for years. We don't need the Reproductive Health Act. I remember I was here as a staffer. We don't need it because Roe will never be overturned. So don't bother amending the penal law, which is where originally the provisions about abortions were, and putting it in the public health law. Finally, we got that passed. Then once Roe was overturned, oh, well, it's never going to bother New York, and we fought for the constitutional amendment. These are important things. The fact that people say it's not going to happen, we've been proven wrong on that. It did happen. We lost a right that women thought was theirs. And I'm not talking about women who identify as Democrats or liberals. I'm talking about regular people who find themselves in a difficult situation and want to have control over their own destiny. That was taken away. And so New York has to do what it must do to be a leader in this area.
And for New Yorkers who may not know, how will the Equal Rights Amendment protect them in the Constitution should we see potential federal threats on reproductive freedoms?
Well, it depends what happens at the federal level. I mean, some federal laws obviously are preemptive of state laws, and we're mindful of that. There are things that Congress could do that would make it very hard for us to use this state constitutional protection. But short of that, if there's efforts by any state agency or outside agency of government to do things that limit the right of access to reproductive health care, including abortion and miscarriage care and all the other parts, let's not forget that, of reproductive health care, we have a remedy. We are going to have to be right on top of our toes to see what happens federally and respond promptly and to be in the lead, which I'm confident in New York with my colleagues and certainly with Majority Leader Stewart Cousins, and I'm sure the governor and Speaker Hastie and my other colleagues, we're going to be in the front of line to doing what we have to do. This is not a minuscule issue. This is an issue of the deepest personal part for a woman. I always talk about that. This is not like some abstract thing. This is personal. This is like, I've met over the years many people who would never define themselves as pro-choice, who thought they had this right, and their granddaughters had this right, and now they don't under federal law. So we're going to do everything to protect those women.
And what did you make of all the controversy around the ballot language when it came to the Equal Rights Amendment? How do you think that impacted voters as they headed into the polls in November?
Well, I was in a district where those that were anti-Proposition 1 used all of these issues of the language, girls' sports, having medical procedures without parental consent. And I had to absolutely confront each of these arguments as being inaccurate under the law. And I did. And also there was a whole activist group of women who literally went and educated people who didn't know about this amendment to push back against this sort of barrage of inaccurate information. I'm very, very pleased at how well we did. But it wasn't just by nature. It was by organizing, by advocating, and by educating people that this misinformation was in fact inaccurate. You're going to retain the rights you had, and many of these rights already exist under New York law already, but we're putting them in the Constitution now to make sure they're good. And
as you know, Republicans have filed lawsuits against the Equal Rights Amendment before it had gone to the, or even during the process of trying to get it on the ballot. What do you make of that controversy? Do you think that will continue even after it's been officially approved by voters?
Well, it was approved, and it's effective immediately. People can sue. You know, I was in the Attorney General's office. The state of New York gets sued every day. The world doesn't end because someone threatens a suit or brings a suit. But we rely on courts to make reasonable judgments based on the law and precedent. And New York law is strong on these issues of constitutional rights, and we have now made it even stronger. So I'm confident in the New York place that we'll be okay. But it is this possibility of federal action that we have to be on our toes.
And how much of that will play into legislative session, the looking out for federal action? How prepared are you, I guess, and have you had discussions like off session about that?
We have been talking to the advocates. We have people who are sitting in Washington watching every day what happens. And particularly once, you know, President-elect Trump becomes the president, whatever actions he takes by executive order, through the agencies, around Congress, that is, for me, the greatest fear. Congress is a long, cumbersome process. Yes, the Republicans have the majority, but not all members of the Republican majority in the Senate or the House are in a rush to make abortion the centerpiece of their work. They recognize that, again, even in conservative districts and with the women who are not political, these are personal issues. They need to be very, very mindful of sticking into. So we're going to watch the administrative process, the regulatory process, and the congressional process, and be ready to respond promptly when things happen.
And do you think we'll see more efforts in the state budget? The governor last year put the Abortion Provider Support Fund into the budget, established that. Do you think this year we could see more money put into that or more efforts to bolster the provider fund on that?
I hope so. And I hope that money is spread among those who, equally among many who are providing care. Many of these doctors who are providing prescription abortion medication by telemedicine are not able to charge the clients, the patients, the amount it costs simply to send the prescription. They can't afford it, these women. And so they do it at their own cost. The doctors are doing it out of their pocket. They ought to be compensated for the cost of these medications and the sending and the mailing so that they are not losing. And right now that has not occurred. We need the law to be modified so that they get some of this money and we add more money to that pot.
And how do you think those conversations might go throughout the budget? I know that the budget has a lot of competing priorities, but do you think that will be something that's widely supported?
I think so. I think, again, most of my colleagues dealing with their constituents recognize that they want to support these efforts of New York to be in the lead. And I think the Democratic majorities in both houses will be very clear on that. And they want the funds to be available to those who are out of pocket for doing the work that New York authorizes.
And do you think there's more the state could be doing to address access to birth control? If so, will that potentially be a priority this legislative session?
I think one thing we ought to do in that area is be mindful that other states are ahead of us. Other states are doing even more than we are doing to make access to birth control over-the-counter medication, as much as possible in New York State. We should be in the lead on that. There's been a conversation about sex education in schools for many, many years. We have not moved that bill. I think there may be a time where we're going to have a bigger conversation about how we inform young people in high school about the risks, particularly of pregnancy. So I think there are things we can do, and that we are a step behind some other states, and we need to continue to be talking, as I do, with our other state partners and looking at best practices. New York we're not the leader in everything. I hate to tell people this.
And how much of a role do you think this issue will play during legislative session? I know there's many competing priorities, as you know. How much time do you think this will take, and how will you prevent it from getting lost in translation?
It's not going to get lost. This issue cannot get lost. This is a fundamental personal right. My number one fight is to get money for every public school, and I'm not going to lose that. But at the same time, this is a personal right, a right of your body, your decision that we had. That's unbelievable that we don't have a right that we had before. It's not going to get lost in the sauce, I can assure you. And not just women. The men, I think, in our conference, and frankly, I suspect many of my Republican colleagues at the end of the day are not anxious to go home and explain to their constituents that they reduced a right that has already been eliminated by the Supreme Court. And shame on that court for misleading the members of the Senate about their positions on Roe. That is really unconscionable to me. But this is where we are, and we as New York leaders in this area are going to make our voices heard, and we're not going to drop it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. That's unfortunately all the time we have for today. We were speaking with Senator Shelley Mayer.
Thank you very much.
Earlier this week, Governor Kathy Hochul unveiled her priorities for this year in her State of the State address. She plans to focus on a variety of issues, including affordability, public safety, mental health, and childcare. What stuck out most for state leaders, lawmakers, experts, and advocates was her overarching theme of affordability. In this next segment, we break down the main takeaways from various stakeholders. Heading into the 2025 legislative year, Governor Kathy Hochul plans to focus on a few key areas, including affordability, childcare, subway safety, and education. She started her address by saying two things were clear to her.
Our future depends on the ability of every family to afford the essentials of life and our ability to protect the safety and security of our residents. But we will not achieve these goals without a fight. So my commitment to every New Yorker is this: your family is my fight.
Throughout her hour-and-a-half-long speech, she reviewed various proposals from her nearly 200-page 2025 State of the State book. Political expert Jim Twombly says while he thought her speech was well delivered, Hochul seemed to focus a little too much on her story compared to the state.
It reminded me a little bit more of like a convention speech rollout than a State of the State. But it was delivered well. The one exception might have been that instead of being about the state, there was an awful lot of reference to her early life and her middle-class upbringing and so forth. It almost sounded like it was a campaign announcement of some sort.
Other political experts say they felt the governor spending a lot of time on her history was meant to connect with New Yorkers on the issues. Jerry Powell, adjunct professor at Columbia, says she isn't sure if the campaign-like nature will be perceived as a negative.
I certainly thought it was effective in the sense of connecting, and I think any campaign speech, first and foremost, needs to connect with constituents. I think any opportunity to connect with constituents is a positive.
What stood out to many lawmakers and state leaders was her proposals related to affordability, from cutting middle-class taxes and facilitating inflation rebate checks to building more childcare facilities, expanding the child tax credit, and providing free school meals. Twombly says money is what will be on most New Yorkers' minds from the governor's plans for this year.
Money in their pockets. The sales tax rebate checks, and a cut in middle-class income taxes. I think that's going to resonate most. Whether or not that resonation lasts through November of 2026 is something we'll have to see in terms of her attempts to run for re-election.
Patrick Orecki with the Citizens Budget Commission says the governor's focus on affordability is a great thing, but whether or not the governor's proposals happen all depends on where the state finds the funds.
Yeah, I think, the situation right now is that the state has a lot of cash in the short term. So things like the inflation rebate checks become really possible and an option for how to spend that money. We would encourage the state to set it aside. When you have a big glut of cash like that, you can build your reserves, you can plan for the future a little bit. So some concerns on that front with the use of the money.
Orecki added that reoccurring actions like middle-class tax cuts and expanding the child tax credit can boost affordability, but they'll have to wait for the out-year budget gaps to see how that impacts the state's financial plan. The governor's plan to address affordability also included a proposal to make community college free. SUNY Chancellor John King says he's very excited about the governor's announcement.
And what it will mean is for folks who are 25 to 55, they will be able to come back to community college for free. They'll get help not just with tuition, but also books and fees. And that will allow them to pursue jobs in high demand areas like the semiconductor industry, advanced manufacturing, IT and cybersecurity, nursing, where we have a huge need across the state. So this is really about fostering economic development, making education affordable for more New Yorkers.
This proposal, in addition to her other affordability proposal to provide free school meals, seemed to be on education advocates' minds following her address. Melinda Person, the president of New York State United Teachers, says free school meals is a proposal education advocates have been pushing for a long time.
Our families in New York State are really struggling to feed their children. 1 in 6 kids is struggling with food insecurity. So this initiative is a huge step forward in addressing this unmet need.
Person adds students who are properly nourished perform better in school.
Educators know that if a kid is hungry, they can't learn. They can't concentrate. They can't pay attention. It impacts their absenteeism. It impacts their test scores.
For some state leaders, the governor's proposals on childcare were top of mind. The New York State Office of Children and Family Services, or OCFS, Commissioner Damia Harris-Madden says the governor's proposals to build more childcare facilities and implement a substitute pool will significantly help struggling families in the state.
That's exciting because so many of our organizations struggle with capacity, physical infrastructure. We also are celebrating the fact that there's a substitute pool that's proposed. Too often we have our childcare providers who are struggling when their staff becomes sick, and now we'll be able to develop a pool so that we have, the capacity to continue the business and take care of our children.
Affordability may have been Hochul's focus, but she also highlighted issues of public safety, including a proposal to expand outreach and security on New York City subway lines. This issue in particular seemed to be on the minds of some political leaders more so than affordability. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, following the governor's address, said the governor understands the city's focus on subway safety and bringing down crime, and he looks forward to their continued partnership. This issue also seems to be top of mind for some lawmakers. State Senator Andrew Lanza, a Republican representing Staten Island, says he is encouraged by the governor's acknowledgement on the issue of subway crime.
For years, myself and Republican colleagues have been pointing out that we have a crime problem on the subway. The subway is filthy. The subway is not running efficiently. The MTA is doing a terrible job. And for a couple of years, we were told by the governor and others from her party that it was just we were imagining all this. So it's good that she is acknowledging that there's a problem, and I hope she does something about it. And if she does, we'll be there to work with her to make sure that happens.
Some Democrats say public safety is a top issue for many New Yorkers.
The details are going to be important here, and that's going to be our job over the next couple of weeks and months in determining how we execute on actually keeping people safe.
While the governor hit on a lot of key issues, she failed to mention the migrant crisis, something on the minds of many lawmakers.
I'm disappointed she didn't really focus on the migrant crisis. It is a tremendous problem here in the state of New York.
Some political experts say the governor excluding the migrant crisis from her speech was likely because much of this particular issue depends on federal actions.
By no means did I feel that omission meant that won't be something that's going to be a priority this year. no doubt about it, that's going to be part of the equation.
Some Democrats also stress the state of the state is just the beginning.
I'm looking forward to the budget hearings where we're going to get some of these details out. We're going to be able to question some of the state agency reps to see exactly how they plan to execute on this vision.
Whether or not the governor's various priorities actually come to fruition all depends on the next steps in this legislative session term. As lawmakers mentioned, the next step here is the budget. That process will begin next week and will take months moving forward before it is completed and passed into law. And for more information on the governor's State of the State proposals, you can visit our website. Again, that's at nynow.org. Well, that does it for this week's edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,